Uh, well, the title of my talk this morning is Stories from a Pastor on the Ground, and that means basically that I am responsible for giving you a first-hand report on how is Brazil like. And I would like, of course, to do that and share some personal stories, but also I would like to give you a little bit of Brazilian Reformed history. So I would like to start going back to the 1500s. As some of you may know, the Protestant Reformation in Europe and the Iberian conquest of Latin America were contemporaneous events. Things that were happening, there were a lot of things happening in Europe at that time, but at the same time there was a lot of things happening outside of Europe. Portugal is the country that discovered Brazil, but they were not the only seafaring nation that was interested in Brazil. Nearly 40 years after Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the the castle church of Wittenberg, a group led by Nicolas Duran Villeganon. I'll have to say some French names, so English is not my first language. French is not any language in my repertoire, so just bear with me, okay? So the name of this guy is Nicolas Duran Villeganon, and he arrived at a small island in the Guanabara Bay, Brazilian colonial city of what is now known as Rio de Janeiro, as we say, Rio de Janeiro. There they established a colony called France Antarctique. Now, to gain support for this enterprise, Villeganon agreed to make the colony into a refuge for Huguenot Protestants of France who were fleeing the persecution of the Roman Catholic Church. So in 1555, in order to help with this colony, Villeganon wrote a letter to John Calvin asking him, specifically for ministers of the Word of God, along with other men well instructed in the Christian religion, to be sent to the New World. So 2 years later, Geneva's answer arrived, and 14 Huguenots, including 2 pastors, disembarked in Brazil. On the same day, the first Protestant worship service in the Americas was celebrated. The next Sunday, they organized the first evangelical church of the Americas, and the Lord's Supper, according to the Reformed rite, was administered for the first time in the New World. Everything seemed to be going very well up to that point, from March to June of that year, until, as it happens in Reformed circles, Brazil experienced its first theological controversy. What started as a dispute over the addition of water to the wine and the use of unleavened bread to the Lord's Supper soon turned into a debate regarding Christ's presence in the sacrament, which dramatically changed Villeganon's treatment of the Huguenots in the colony. Now, the Huguenots were already fleeing persecution, and seeing the change in Villeganon, they were, of course, worried about it. Their plans to find refuge in the New World seemed to be going to fall apart, so most of them decided to sail back to France in a ship that was already falling apart. They made their way back, barely alive, but they made their way back. And meanwhile, 5 of them were left behind. And although they left the island, the colony and the island, to go live in Brazil's mainland among the indigenous tribes, this is not the end of their story. One of them fell ill in mainland Brazil, and the others decided to go back to the fortified island, where Villeganon sent them a list of questions regarding controversial points. So they arrived there, and this guy just has a list of theological questions for them, and he gives it to them and say, you have 12 hours to come back with answers to what I'm asking you. They accepted the challenge, and despite the short deadline, they answered with what came to be known as Guanabara's Confession, which is the first Reformed confession of faith written in the Americas. It was a confession written in Latin and presented to Villeganon with their signatures. Now, this is an interesting fact, as someone who loves the Confessions, it's very interesting to know about their history. And if you thought, as I did a long time ago, that the Belgic Confession was the only confession written by a martyr, well, there are more. After trying to dissuade the Huguenots from their conviction, Villeganon, who is now known historically as the Cain of Americas, arrested them and used the confession to condemn them for heresy. Jean de Bourdelle was the main writer, was violently beaten, bound, and thrown into the sea to drown. Mathieu Verneuil faced the same end. Finally, they went after the guy that was sick in the indigenous tribe. They found him, Pierre de Bourdon, and after being strangled, he was also thrown into the sea. This all happened less than 1 year after their arrival. And they sealed their testimony in Brazil with their own lives. And this is how the first seeds of Reformation were planted into my country. Now, of course, it doesn't sound like a successful mission trip or anything like that. So nearly 50 years later, when the Iberian kingdoms were united under the same crown, the Dutch decided to target their colonies in what they considered to be an act of just war against Spain. And this led to the invasion of Brazil. Despite facing great resistance, by 1630 they had gained control of significant territories, and eventually half of Brazil's 14 provinces were under the Dutch rule. Curiously enough, the governor of Dutch Brazil was a guy called João Maurice of Nassau. He's the great-nephew of William the Silent, and he invested heavily in Brazil. Heavily. He brought scientists, artists, craftsmen along with him. He built a zoo in Brazil, an observatory. He started schools in almost every province and also in the indigenous tribes. There were plans for even humanities university in Brazil at that time. He established representative councils for local government. This is some of the things he did, so many things he did, and he was even considered a humanist prince in the New World. He was really, really fruitful, so fruitful that he has been called John the Brazilian. So the Reformed Church was the official state church of Brazil. Recife, the capital of Dutch Brazil, was angrily called by one of the most well-known Jesuits of the time the Geneva of Brazil. In total, they had 22 congregations, many of them with their own consistories. There were many men from different nations serving as ministers in Dutch Brazil, which is very peculiar. You had men from the Netherlands, Germany, men from England, France, and even Spanish ministers working in Dutch Brazil. They had presbyteries formed. They had even a national synod for a couple of years, which was something very funny for me to find out after knowing the Reformed faith, that this had happened in the 17th century in my country. But at the same time, it doesn't mean they were the only church in Brazil at that time. While Europe was still living through the 30 Years' War, this Dutch version of Brazil had the greatest degree of religious liberty in the Western world. It was so free, in one sense, that even the Reformed protested such freedom, because the Catholics were not quite used not to being the main guys, not quite used to not being the official church, and they were kind of bold in their interactions, and the Reformed didn't like that as much as they should or could. Now, this Dutch church in Brazil, it was surely transplanted. It was not a natural church. It was not fruit of church planting as we do it nowadays. It was basically came with the Dutch immigration. But at the same time, they made a clear effort to become a missionary church in Brazil. They were serious about it, very serious about it. It wasn't long before they started working to evangelize Dutch people that were not believers, working with the Portuguese, with Jews, Africans, and also with the indigenous people of Brazil. And as it's still today, literature was an important tool back then, although many times it was available only in Spanish. The Bible itself, for example, was translated into Portuguese. The New Testament was translated and published only in 1681 by Almeida, who is known as the Portuguese Luther. And so they very likely used the Spanish Reina Valera. And they did have a Psalter as well, which they used in Dutch, was the Psalter translated by Peter Datin, which is the father of Reformed Dutch liturgy. They had catechisms, like the Heidelberg Catechism, the shorter version of the Heidelberg that many never heard about, written by Hermanus Falcellius. They had a catechism that they prepared in Tupi, which was the main indigenous language of Brazil. And curiously enough, the Reformed Catholic by William Perkins was in Brazil at that time. It was used for the evangelization of the Portuguese specifically. I made sure to use this talk, and I'm glad to inform you that I've used this lecture to convince my editor that we should translate and publish this in Portuguese, and now we're working on that title, and soon we will have the Reformed Catholic in Portuguese as well. So what happened is that although the Dutch were doing very well, things were going well, with the departure of Count of Nassau and Portugal's growing strength, the Dutch Brazil quickly unraveled. The Portuguese-Brazilian population started an insurrection. They were backed by Portugal's crown and by the Catholic Church, and this insurrection culminated in 2 battles. In the second one, there's a very interesting story of an indigenous reformed leader called Pedro Poti. He was captured. He was a leader of the Dutch defense. He was captured. He spent more than 2 years in prison, where he was tortured for refusing to renounce what was called in Brazil at that time the Reformed heresy. And finally, he died as the first indigenous Protestant martyr in Brazil, also being thrown into the water to his death. Finally, after 24 years in Brazil, in 1654, after the siege of Recife, the Dutch capitulated. Once again, a document was signed, but this time was a formal renouncement of the Dutch claim of Brazil. And with that, the Reformed Church disappeared from colonial Brazil once again. And once again, nothing was left behind but seeds. Seeds. Now, more than 150 years passed before the Protestant Reformation reached Brazil again. Starting at the beginning of the 19th century, we've had many different waves of Protestants arriving in Brazil. Anglicans, Lutherans, Congregationalists, then finally Presbyterians, and then Baptists as well. But now the King of Portugal had moved to the New World, and Brazil was now the seat of the Portuguese Empire. And with that, Roman Catholicism was the official religion, which means that it was only after the Republic was established that the Protestants had the right to public worship. Before then, what happened was basically they would have to worship secretly or just hope to be ignored by the government. Now, due to the fact that these early attempts at introducing the Reformation theology didn't have proper continuity, Brazil never had a strong Reformed heritage. It was always something that it began, but it didn't continue. So after the arrival of these different Protestant groups, the work had basically to start from scratch. Everything had to be done all over again. And Well, the Reformed had a confusing medley of reference points. For example, you would have the Presbyterians being influenced by Charles Hodge and the theology of the Princeton on one hand, but on the other, you would have the influence of Charles Finney and the practice of the Second Great Awakening. So you can see how confusing that was. So although God surely has used their efforts to water those previous seeds, Brazil was still heavily influenced by the Counter-Reformation. And up to the 1960s, the Protestants did not come to exceed 4% of the Brazilian population in Brazil. Now, since the 1980s, the situation has changed dramatically. While many places are experiencing rediscovery of Reformed theology in the last 30 to 40 years, it would be more appropriate to say that Brazil is still discovering it. And despite the fact that the internet has been its main catalyst in the last decades, literature is certainly one of the main tools God has used to spark this new interest in the Reformation. This is how many people are encountering it, and this is surely the way I encountered it. More than 15 years ago, when my wife and I were newly married, we were studying church history with a couple of friends, and we were having some fun with some of the crazy stories we do have in our long history. We were reading Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, Fox's Book of Martyrs. But as we were progressing through history, we started reading more and more about men like Charles Spurgeon and William Carey, Adoniram Judson, Brainerd, Jonathan Edwards. So these names started popping up everywhere. And while that was all very encouraging, to say the least, I was still struggling to understand what kind of conviction such men had to live in the way they did. I remember very clearly that we do have a book in Brazil, which is like a compilation of short biographies by great men. And you do have many Reformed names there. And they do make a point of telling how they did great things, whatever they were. But there was never a point of mentioning what they believed in, what was behind all that they were done, they had done. So what happens is that while I struggled with that, we started hearing about the so-called Puritans, and we were like really clueless as to what was that, until I came across J.I. Packer's book, Amongst the Giants of God, which seemed the kind of book I was looking for. It said something about the Puritans, and well, let's go for it. And while I was reading it, everything really started to make sense. Now things started to feel more proper. This is what these guys believed. This is why they did what they did. This is how they actually lived. And so suddenly we realized we needed more books. To be honest, I still think I need more books, but this started way back there. So with time, I realized that many of the classical works of the Reformation were still unavailable in Portuguese. The Brazilian publishing market is surely very different from the English American market, and we started looking for these great works, and we surely found some of them. The Institutes of the Christian Religion by Calvin was the first of his works to be published in Brazil, but it was published in the late 1980s. And although the main man responsible for making the great reformer speaking Portuguese, who is a faithful Presbyterian minister called Walter Graciano Martins, a man who I admire a lot, he still works with our publishing house, to be honest. He's an old man now, but it's still a blessing to us. He has translated all of Calvin's remaining works. Most of them are still unpublished due to the lack of funds. Still, thanks to his efforts, mainly, works like Charles Hodge's Systematic Theology, Turretin's Institutes, they're all published in Portuguese thanks to his translation work. I have all those books. So there's a wide interest in books about, there's also a wide interest in books about marriage and child rearing. And this is a very interesting thing. And the main reason for that, I believe, is that evangelical families in Brazil are not only resisting an ungodly culture, but they are also fighting a lack of their own Christian family heritage. It's not something that they know. Many evangelicals do not have solid references or examples to follow, and first-generation Christians are fighting to establish a family culture that they basically have never experienced. Besides, unfortunately, sometimes even the Reformed leadership are setting bad examples of family life, with marriages ending in divorce and kids being brought up without a proper Christian education. So this has sparked something of a revolution in Brazil in regards to Christian education, something to the likes of what Dr. Vishal Mangawadi calls the third education revolution. Many parents started looking for alternatives to the terrible education offered by the secular state in Brazil, and although they just started kind of trying to flee from all the bad stuff, they ended up embracing Christian education, a distinctive Christian education. So new Christian schools are being founded in Brazil. There are a lot of projects for that. There are things like that happening. New classical Christian schools popping up as well. But it's more significant probably if we look to homeschooling culture in Brazil. The number of homeschooling homeschooling families in Brazil have increased more than 2,000% in the last 10 years. So it's just went boom. And despite they're having few curricular options and facing a lot of government pressure, the work is going on. They're just facing all of that and trying to build something that we honestly don't have. In our own church, we have started an educational program called Paideia in order to help other Christian families to provide our own kids as well as help them with distinct Christian education. We have people from many different churches, many different traditions working side by side for this common goal. We're doing all kinds of different stuff. We did have some people from Moscow visiting us, had to see some wild animals. We're trying to do something to the likes of Gordon Wilson's project. We had a 10-feet boa one day, and then another. This year we're doing something of a lunatic farming as well. So there are fun pictures coming out of those classes for sure. And we are working with many different people in doing that. What is interesting is this is not something that is happening just in my city. It's something that is clearly spread all across the country. People are doing that. They're taking initiative. They're trying to do something. They're trying to accomplish something. And it's been working. It's bearing good fruit. So again, the scenario in Brazil has changed a lot since the 80s. The percentage I mentioned of the evangelical Protestant population went from 4% to 30% in Brazil. They are expecting to be bigger even than Catholics by the next 10 years. But all this growth was largely due to the rapid growth of Pentecostal and new Pentecostal churches in Brazil. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there is no growth in our own camp. In the last 10 years, many new Reformed churches also have started in Brazil, including our own. We have seen Presbyterians leading the work in church planting, evangelization, and things like that happening, and it's sure a blessing to see all of this happening. Over the years, I was always surprised, for example, by the amount of people we met, especially from Pentecostal and new Pentecostal backgrounds that have come to know the Reformed faith by listening to the shocking message by Paul Washer. I've lost count of how many times I talked to someone and asked, like, how did you end up here? They said, I watched a video, I watched a lecture, a preaching by this guy, and this is the consequence of that. It was always very surprising, especially because I never heard it. It was not something that happened in our circles, I think. I was told he says something about the Britney Spears in that sermon. Apparently, the letters can be rearranged to spell Presbyterians, but I'm not sure that's what convinced these people to go to Reformed churches, but it surely worked. So, as it happened with me, the interest in Reformed theology has driven many people to look for Reformed churches. We still receive constant emails asking for solid church recommendations. This happens a lot. Brazil, remember, is a big country, and sometimes people they get to hear about us or the publishing work, and they get our email. They send, "Do you know any solid church in our area?" And it's sadly to say, many times I have to say, "No, I don't." Sometimes it's just because I don't know, of course, but it's clearly a hard scenario in lots of places in Brazil. And we still receive constant contact in that regard. But I do remember well when I was the one looking for churches, when I started reading about all this stuff, and I was like, we need to find a church that believes all these things that we are hearing about. And then my wife and I, we were like just visiting one church after another, asking in every one of them, what confession of faith do you subscribe to? Which I know I was being kind of weird, but to be honest, some of the churches we were visiting they were also very weird. And they were more surprised than us with the answers that came out of those conversations. So while Brazil does need more Reformed churches, it is clear that our tradition now has a wider influence in evangelical circles. With other traditions constantly interacting with Reformed theology, they're either looking for better answers or concerned with such a dangerous theology. So you get both things for sure. There's more of an interest. There's people coming from different backgrounds, and sometimes they are not leaving their traditions, but they have realized that there are better theology available, and they can enrich their own take. They can enrich their own churches. There are things like that happening a lot. Publishing work for sure has helped with this. We have Pentecostals publishing Matthew Henry in Brazil, which is something that we look and say, what's happening here, right? And there are such things happening, and sometimes you see people that were never interested in theology now, in churches not interested in theology, now talking about how they can adopt some kind of confession of faith so they can properly explain what they believe in. So this is all great things happening. But be it as it may, we are in a position for sure to offer the kind of leadership and example that will bring the Brazilian church to a more mature theology and practice. The Reformed really can do that. This is something really achievable in Brazil, and it's something that we're praying to, so that more men embrace that task. In the meantime, what we do is basically we keep watering those seeds. We keep honoring those that came before us as we sow new seeds for the generations to come, expecting by God's grace for an even bigger harvest in our country. Now, in conclusion, while these stories paint a hopeful scenario, and I'm sure it's interesting to hear about it and to get to know things that it's likely not in your current news in America, it does not mean that we do not have many challenges in Brazil. As one of our poets has said, Brazil is really not for beginners. Brazil is not for beginners. We are a huge country. We're a huge country and very diverse in population, terrain, culture, much like the United States for sure. Our people, funny enough, they hate politicians, but sadly, they love the state. We're a joyful people for sure, but we have serious problems with violent crime. We are one of the countries with the most Christians in the world, but we are also known for a debauched carnival that celebrates our own wickedness and that of the many foreigners that come to visit Brazil. We do have a very strong Catholic heritage including the Jesuits and all of their tricks. But we are becoming more and more evangelical with time. We even have a member in our own church whose name is Aquinas, and I can guarantee you his family was not Ventilian. So in our own church, we have such a crazy mixture of things happening. We have people coming from a variety of contexts, from Roman Catholicism to new Pentecostal churches, from actual pagan religions to atheism. But this small congregation of Brazilians are embracing the Reformed tradition. They're getting to know it. They're learning to honor their fathers in the faith, including, especially when necessary, the most Protestants of virtues, civil disobedience. We did have a very fun experience in Brazil in the last years. So even though some have to commute in our church, we are answering to God's call to worship, to hear the gospel of grace, to celebrate the supper every Lord's Day. Although we are made up mostly of first-generation Christians, we have our families committed to bring their kids up in the paideia of God and working along with other Christians to that end. The Reformed faith may be a wild branch in Brazil, but it's being grafted, and it's being successfully grafted. Those seeds are actually flourishing, and they will bear much fruit. And Brazilians do have what has been called a Baroque soul. It's a very good way of presenting Brazilians. We are full of contrasts, contradictions, and this is exactly why I believe that a confident Chestertonian Calvinism will be the way for a truly tropical Reformation. This is how we get there. This is how we go on. And as we are learning the importance of theological solidity, the beauty of classical liturgy, the blessing of covenantal education, the potency of a joyful gospel that can be applied and should be applied to every area of life, as we learn to do that, as this grows and flourishes in our country, we will see its particular glory being manifested in Brazil. But we still do have a lot of work ahead. There's many things to be done and accomplished. And I honestly hope we can count with your prayers, with your encouragement and support. They surely have been a great blessing for us, a great blessing for our church. It's great not to feel alone. And we appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And we will keep laboring in our soil to see the gospel flourish. Thank you.